Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Workforce Wednesday webinar, our double feature session at 1 o'clock this afternoon. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be your moderator and technical support for this session. So please feel free to reach out to me via the chat if you experience any technical difficulties and need help troubleshooting them. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started today. Today's presentation is titled WIOA Primary Indicators of Performance, specifically Measurable Skill Gains. And so if you could go to the next slide for me, Mark. This is just my introduction slide for myself. And then we'll start off with our beginning polls. So I'm going to put up the first poll, which we'd just like to know this afternoon where you're joining us from. Where is your local area? So I'm going to put that up and let you start answering that as I continue with our housekeeping items. So as a reminder, all participants on this webinar are in listen-only mode and you cannot unmute yourselves. So we ask that you pose any questions, comments, or concerns in the chat. And this also allows us to have a hard copy of all your questions for our purposes after the session. And then this session is being recorded. And today's recording will be up within 48 hours on our website, on our center's website, which I can put in the chat momentarily, and then up on Illinois WorkNet as well. So I'm going to end this poll and share the results with everyone. We have most of you joining from Northern Illinois this afternoon and up near Chicago, and a couple from Central Illinois and from Southern as well. So I'm joining you from Central Illinois today in Decatur, and our center is located in Bloomington Normal. So welcome to my fellow Central Illinoisans. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Mark, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll put up our next poll, which is, what is your role in the WIOA system? And so this is a multiple choice, so you can feel free to select multiple if those are applicable to you. And then while this poll is up, I wanted to let everyone know that we do have closed captioning available live for accessibility reasons this afternoon, and you can turn that on using your live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. So please feel free to utilize those if they help you follow along with the session or if you need them for accessibility reasons. And then I will also be putting in the chat the link to the slide deck. So if you'd like to follow along with the presentation today, you can do so by accessing the slide deck here. And so I'm putting that in the chat right now for everyone. Give it a couple more seconds to answer the polls. And then I also wanted to let everyone know that as we are finishing up this poll, that you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow from the Zoom platform with the link to the recording and presentation from today, as well as a link to a follow-up survey. And we would greatly appreciate if you take 5 minutes out of your workday to provide us with feedback for our Workforce Wednesday webinars, as well as specifically for this session. I'm also going to put that same survey link in the chat towards the end of the session as well, if you want to take it following the session while it's timely in your head. So I'm going to share the results. So most of you are joining us from Title I career planners, directors, one-stop operators, local board staff, and other WIOA partners and stakeholders. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing that. And then Mark, if you want to go to the next slide and take us away for the start of the presentation.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Just looking at the results of that second poll there, it's great to see a nice wide variety of individuals representing our local systems today. Primarily, there might be a few of you who are state representatives as well. I do want to say one thing for those, especially that are staff or one-stop operators that work directly with your local board members, local board chairs, and CEOs. Keep in mind all of these performance sessions, and if you think that it's something that they would benefit from, let them know when they're scheduled as you get invitations to them. Share those with your board members. Also, direct them to all the recorded sessions so they can watch them on their own time and continue to learn more and more about performance. It's something that's one of their obligations or functions as a local board. So it'd be great to see some of those joining some of these calls. And then second to that point, if you know there's some specific training around performance that you think your board members, your chief elected officials, and one-stop operators could benefit from, contact Paul or I and let us know. And if we need to schedule something specific for those individuals and representatives of the system, we certainly would welcome that opportunity. So get your minds going and figure out ways where we can include them more and more in these sessions and help them build their knowledge and understanding of performance in general. You see here in front of you our team, our three-person team. We've got a lot more that we rely on, obviously, as well as all of you in the local area. But Patty is our manager of performance and technology, overseeing both the performance side and all of our systems that are developed and updated and available for all of you to use for your career planning, case management functions. Paula is our resident expert around performance, been around for quite a while. She'll be presenting most of the information today. And I am Mark Burgess. I'm the performance manager, been with the WIOA system for over 16 years and now over a year and a half, I guess, in performance. Before that, held multiple roles, including policy development and working for the State Workforce Board. So we'll move forward and you'll hear from Paul and I throughout today's section. We will be talking about MSGs today. Hopefully that's what you came for. We had a Performance 101 session about 3 weeks ago that kind of touched on all of the performance measures. Today, we're going to focus only on the MSG measure, still at somewhat of a high level. There's just so much about the MSG measure to talk about. We're breaking this down into a couple sessions. We'll talk about that second session at the end of today and remind you again in future sessions where it's going to be more of an interactive discussion around MSGs and really digging deep into some of the scenarios you have on a daily basis that you present to Paul and myself that we try to respond to, and any others that you might have that you want to share and discuss with the team. But today we're really going to just talk about MSGs at a high level, all of the types of MSGs that could be achieved. There are 5 of those types. And then we want to make sure we understand the time frames for MSGs as it relates to when they're earned, the program years, and participation, and how those interact in determining whether an MSG is actually achieved. And while the bottom bullet point might suggest we're going to get into the systems of record, we're not really going to pull those up today. We're not going to show you examples of those. But I think throughout the presentation and discussion, you'll hear things that will kind of trigger your minds to remember screens, especially in the IWDS, and maybe for those of you up north, the Career Connect system. So again, this isn't a case management type presentation. Want to get you an understanding of the measure, and then you can kind of apply that to how you track appropriately all of the outcomes for your participants. We're going to do a lot of scenarios today, try and get you all involved. So Kirsten, if you can put the first one up. Simple one to get you started. We got an individual who is a Title I youth, out of school youth specifically. And during the program year, she participated in mentoring and internship and also some on-the-job training. So we'll wait for Kirsten to get this poll up for you to respond to. Or is it up, Kirsten? Am I not seeing it? Okay, must be having some issues with that poll. We'll work on that. So for those of you, we'll go ahead and move on to kind of an explanation of this measure. That's how we're going to do it throughout each of these scenarios. And in between, we'll be talking about the measure itself. So if you responded no, you were correct today. Let's look back at that scenario again. She's an out-of-school youth and participated in quite a few things during the program year, and in fact got a positive report from the employer on these services and activities. However, as we look at the explanation, these types of services and activities are not considered education or training for a WIOA youth. So she would not be included in the indicator, would not become be able to be a positive, even though what she did was great work, achieved something. It's just not something that would be countable in the measurable skill gain for this individual. However, if this was an out of school youth, we want to note that there are other types of training that would include them in the measure, including occupational skills training, or secondary, post-secondary education, and a few other of the WIOA programs in general. Move on to understanding that, everything we provide to you in guidance through our WIOA notices and WIOA policy is all directed from Department of Labor and what they have outlined in the WIOA Act, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. Specifically, Section 116 speaks to performance, and then several sections of the WIOA final rules speak to the different elements of performance as they relate to the different programs under WIOA, specifically Title I, Adult Dislocated Worker and Youth, as well as some others. And then there are other guidance and issuances by the Departments of Labor and Education that we must comply with, and those are found in the training employment guidance letters, TEGLs, and training employment notices, TENS. So you need to become familiar with those. We'll give you some of those examples or references at the end of our discussion today. I'm going to turn it over to Paula now. She's going to talk about MSG, but as you can see here, it's just one of 6 indicators of performance. So we'll focus on the MSG today. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark. And like Mark just said, we know that we have 6 core measures of performance, 6 indicators, but today we are going to focus solely on the measurable skill gains, otherwise known as MSG. Next slide, please. Okay, so measurable skills gain. As we get into this discussion, I just want to do a broad overview of this measure because it's unique. First of all, it's unique to WIOA. We never had it before. And then it's one big measure, but it's calculated by looking at all different types of MSGs. So we have the MSG indicator, then we have all these types under this measurable skills gain umbrella. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind with this measure is we're used to just getting wage uploads and we have all these performance indicators, but for the measurable skills gain, this needs to be recognized. So in order to recognize skills gains, we just have to know about them. So once we get it in our minds, the overall purpose of what we're looking for with these gains, it'll be a little easier to look for these when you're dealing with your participants day to day. We're understanding the measure. The purpose of this measure is intended to track and measure big and small progressions that your participants are making throughout the year and based on their different training services. It's not just cut and dry. So all of these, your training participants are doing different things. They're in school youth, they're adults. So we're looking for these specific achievements they're making as they achieve their employment and training goals through pathways. It's not just the end goal, like a credential, for example. So that's the concept. Department of Labor, the intention of this measure, they're just looking through gains that measure progress, not just the end goal, it's the progress. And again, these are all related to the services you're providing them, in particular, their training services. But it's all of the things they're working for during these trainings. And in the end, it's to help fulfill the vision of a workforce system that's serving diverse sets of individuals that need all different types of training. So that's the concept of the measurable skills gain. Next slide, please. Another really important thing to understand about this measure, and one of its ways that it's unique, is that not everyone is in this measure. It's people who are in training. And if you think about it, it makes sense. We wouldn't be holding you accountable for all of these gains achieved through your training and benchmarks like that if you weren't in training. So that's one thing that's always important to remember. One important point, all in-school youth are included in this measure. Why? Because they're in school, they're in education or training, hence we want to see their gains. For out-of-school youth, there are a couple nuances to this. So these are out-of-school youth who are, during a program year, enroll in a training program or education, post-secondary education, leading to a high school diploma or its equivalent, or a post-secondary degree. And this is excluding out-of-school youth who are in work-based training, specifically OJTs, because that's not training for out-of-school youth. So you have an out-of-school youth, they're not in school when they come in, but you enroll them or place them, and they're going to count in your measurable skills gain. So you'll need to be looking at their gains. So adult and dislocated workers, a little bit more straightforward. During the program year, it's any adult or dislocated worker who is enrolled in education or training during the program year. And like I said, unlike the credential attainment measure, adults and dislocated workers who are in an OJT or customized training are included in MSG. So I won't get into credential today, I promise, but do know that it's different. You're off the hook for the credential if you have an adult and an OJT. Adults and dislocated workers in your OJT programs are going to be in your MSG, so you need to track their gains. And like I mentioned above, all in-school youth are in the measure no matter what, no matter if they drop out of training or their training program status, they're going to be in the measure each program year. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to looking at the overall method for figuring out how we achieve measurable skills gain, and then again, how your LWIA will rate when we look at the percentages of these. So it's just the percentage of your participants who are in training and who are achieving these measurable skills gain one by one, and they're defined as documented, academic, technical, occupational, or other forms of progress that we're all going to talk about. And then again, we point this out because it's kind of, you can forget when you're looking at your performance, you're like, wait, OJT isn't training, but it is for the measurable skills gain. So always want to be aware of that. It's easy to forget sometimes. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's the calculation. Again, this is more for your reference, like a desk guide, so you can always go back and figure out how these are calculated when we come up with your percentage. So it's the number of participants during the reporting period who are in training, and then they achieve a gain, at least one, divided by everyone who is in a training in that program year. So this is leading to a very important point. It's not divided by those who exit during the program year. It's everyone who's participating in training in the program year, and they're in it every single year. They're participating in training. So it is not an exit-based measure, and we will explain that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is basically a nice overview of what I was talking about when I said it's one indicator with several different ways that it's measured, and we call them types. So the first type of MSG is an MSG for an educational functioning level. We call those EFLs. This even has a couple parts to it because there's a pre and post test comparison for the EFL, and then a second type for that EFL, and we're going to talk about those. The second type of measurable skills gain is for a secondary diploma or equivalent, just like it says. The third type we're going to talk about is a secondary or post-secondary transcript or report card. So this is a very specific type of MSGs with some rules to it. The fourth type is what we call a training milestone. And the fifth type is what we call a skills progression related to diploma, certificates, credentials, exam-based. So we're going to get on to all of these next. So next slide, please, Mark. Actually, I'm going to hand it over to Mark because he has another little quiz.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. Before we jump into each of those five, some of these scenarios we're trying to get you before you hear from us and hear specifically from Paula about them. Try and test your knowledge up front. So we'll ask Kirsten, hopefully she's got her polls ready. In this scenario, we have Sherry, who's an 18-year-old high school graduate. And while she was in high school, she completed a basic nurse assistant training component and tried to complete the exam a couple different times, but struggled and was unable to do that. So in this scenario, what measures would she potentially be able to achieve? We know we're not giving you much information, but with what we have here, I guess what we're trying to say is which ones can we count potentially, but which ones do we know we can't count? So those would be the ones you wouldn't select, is the ones you know you cannot count from your knowledge. All right, we've got quite a few varieties here. Like to see no one saying none, because this is one as you'll hear more. You know, not that MSGs are easy to achieve, but they are fairly common to achieve. And so with 5 different types, we hope we can always find one for an individual participant during their participation. Great. So most of us are leaning around the training milestone is a possibility, secondary, post-secondary transcript as a possibility, with a few others on the skills progression. We do have a couple that said with what we know, she may not be able to be eligible for or be able to achieve any of these. So let's go ahead and move on to the, if you want to keep that up there while we can see that, move on to the explanation, and we'll kind of give you a reason. So we know there's one thing she cannot achieve, and that's because she's graduated high school, and we cannot get credit for something she's achieved before she's come into the program. Excuse me, sorry. So that's why that one type of MSG is not attainable, because she got that secondary diploma or the equivalent prior to coming to the WIOA program. We don't really know yet, with the information we have, if she can achieve any of the other ones, and maybe she can't achieve any of them. So the nones actually are not an incorrect answer at this point in time, but it would be more than likely that that she's going to be able to achieve something. So unless, Paula, you have anything else to add here, we're going to revisit Sherry here a little bit later in the presentation after we learn about all these MSG types and discuss how she might have achieved each or all of them, other than that secondary diploma or equivalent. Paula?
Thanks. I don't have anything else to add about that, but we will talk about Sherry again. Okay, so like I mentioned before, the 5 types of MSGs, and this is the first type, and it's methods to achieving this MSG for the educational functioning level. We call it an EFL. The first way to get an MSG for EFL is calculated. It's for assessment test score. So this overall is basically a comparison of their pre and post tests, and you need a documented achievement of at least 1 EFL for a participant. So even if they just go from a 6 to a 7, that is documented as an EFL. And actually, a lot of you are aware, I can see the participants, this is one that the system calculates. So it's an exception to the rule. It's going to be calculated for you as you're documenting these test gains. Again, 1 full gain is required, and it's calculated. The second type, the second way or method to achieve an EFL gain as a type of MSG is a little more difficult. It's probably the most convoluted way to get a gain. It's not, it's conditional, so it's not sought after as one of the gains we expect to see all the time, but it is reported for participants who exit a program. And so throughout their participation, they have not been in post-secondary. So WIOA services, WIOA funds didn't provide them any post-secondary education, but you exit them anyway. And after they exit, you find out that they're in post-secondary education or training on their own. That outcome may be documented and it is counted as a gain. So the thought process behind this is that even though they didn't have post-secondary credentials, it's not looking at employment, whatever you provided them with their secondary type training in the program led them to get themselves some post-secondary education. So again, at the bottom, you'll notice on each of these slides, we have included a piece of documentation that is required when you document these. So for the pre and post tests, it's just the results. And for the secondary education MSG, it's just based on the condition of their exit and when you determine and document them to be entered into a post-secondary education or training. Okay, and there is a chat box that Mark's going to kind of track for me. We'll have some opportunities to ask questions too. So just pointing that out if you have any questions at this point. Next slide, please. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this on the first slide. Sometimes I talk ahead of myself, but yeah, so the way this type of gain is calculated, it's comparing a participant's initial education and functioning level pre-test with their post-test. And then this is some operational parameters as a reference that you can look at when you're trying to identify someone who might fall into that method for documenting a gain for the post-secondary condition of this. Next slide, please. Okay, a second type of MSG is called secondary diploma or equivalent, and it is just what that states. It's someone who obtains their certificate of attaining passing scores on all parts of a state-recognized equivalency test, or they obtain their diploma or state-recognized equivalent, demonstrating satisfactory completion of all their secondary studies, or an alternative diploma, including high school or adult secondary. The one thing about this type of MSG, it's its own type, but it is reported under a fifth type of MSG we will talk about, which we call skills progression. So when you think of someone in high school, they have to be in high school in the program to attain this gain. And when you think about that, think about it's a skills progression. They're in secondary, they progressed, so they got their high school diploma or equivalent. This is a skills progression. One important piece of information is that passing less than all parts of a state recognized test will not qualify as an MSG for secondary diploma. It shouldn't be documented that way. Next slide, please. Okay, so a third type of MSG relates to either secondary transcripts or a report card, or post-secondary training transcripts and a report card. And of course, you know, secondary transcripts are only going to apply to someone who comes in without a high school diploma, because we're not going to give you credit if they already had it when they came in your program. So like was mentioned before, participants' transcripts or report card for secondary education should be for one semester that's showing the participant is achieving all of the state's policies for their academic standards. So again, it's specific only to your participants attending high school. So credit hours are based on successful completion and not the number they were enrolled in. So if you have someone who there might be other gains associated with this, secondary transcripts are very specific as far as documentation goes. Next slide, please. So to talk a minute about these post-secondary transcripts or report cards, there's a couple different criteria for these. Full-time students they're pretty straightforward with when you're able to document a post-secondary transcript or report card for them. They must achieve a minimum of 12 credits, or it's 12 credit hours, or it's equivalent within one semester. So that's pretty straightforward. They come in the fall, you have their IEP, for example, with at least 12 credit hours. Come December, they show you a transcript and it's a successful completion. They attained all 12 credit hours. There's your documentation. Part-time students are able to achieve this, but it's a little trickier. It's not tricky, I shouldn't use that word. There's a little more documentation and calculation involved on your part. Again, the system does not calculate MSGs for you, so the documentation and adding it to your system of record is all up to you. So for part-time students, they still need to achieve a minimum of 12 credit hours, but since they're part-time, we know they're not going to be doing it in one semester, so they just need to achieve those 12 credit hours in 2 completed semesters or an equivalent during one 12-month period. And again, they need to be achieving all of these credit hours, not failing one just because they enrolled in a certain number. So again, the documentation for this will have to be a transcript or report card that's showing all of these are being met. The documentation also should always include, which I'm sure the ISS or IEP will, if the student is enrolled full or part-time. You might want to always note your part-time students so you can kind of mark when they've finally met that 12 credit minimum, and then you can actually record this type of gain. Here's one note that we want you to be aware of. It's kind of a scenario. If the first semester begins in one program year and the second semester ends in the next program year, the combination of all of the hours needs to be 12. And we're going to give you a scenario like this later, but the actual gain can't be documented until the 12 are met. So if you enroll in the fall and you have only 4 credit hours successfully completed, but you enroll in the spring and you complete 10 credit hours, it's not documented until after your spring semester is completed, because that equates the 12 credit hours. Next question, please. Next question, next slide, please. Okay, again, there are 2 rules that apply when you're documenting both secondary and post-secondary transcripts or report card. This is really good to keep in mind. It must not show that the participant dropped out or was removed from the institution or any other condition that indicated removal or, on academic or conduct grounds or anything like that. So if they leave the training, you shouldn't document it. So then it needs to be any reasonable verification of a transcript or report card that will meet the requirement for this documentation. And it can be an unofficial transcript or online report card. Next slide, please. Okay.
Well, thanks for going through the first few types of MSGs. We did have one question, and Sarah Graham from WIOA 20, thank you, has tried to help respond to this. Mike Johnson has asked, should the only credentials entered in IWDS be credentials? And when we say IWDS, we also mean any system. So if you're up in the Chicagoland area, it would be the same for Career Connect. So systems of record is how we're trying to refer to it, just so we don't leave anyone out. But should these be recorded in the customer if they enroll in WIOA services, or a credential a customer earned within 1 year after he or she has exited? Example, so we would not enter a high school diploma for a customer who earned the high school diploma 5 years prior to enrollment into WIOA funded services. And Sarah said yes, confirm that. As mentioned in the scenario, we can't take credit for something we didn't assist with. So if they earn their credential, if they earn their licensure, that they earned any type of academic status prior to enrolling in WIOA, we cannot take credit for that. So it should not be considered an MSG. However, and Paul, I'll let you respond to the second half. Sarah kind of added that you do have a period after exit where you could document an MSG.
Correct.
Yeah. So she's indicating it's a year afterwards, right, Paula?
No, actually MSGs need to be documented within the same program year that training took place. So for example, I'm trying to see, oh, let me scroll up. I missed these questions when I was talking so much. Okay, so yeah, Sarah's correct on clarifying that. You should only be entering, you wouldn't be allowed to use that high school diploma for 5 years prior to enrollment. And then
and Sarah's response, I'm sorry, I read it wrong.
Oh yeah.
Isn't regarding an MSG, it's regarding a credential, and that's the difference.
Yes.
We'll touch on that a little bit later, right, Paula?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
timing
we will.
issue. Yeah. Okay. And then
that timing issue with certain training enrollments, there is a timing issue that pertains to the measurable skills gain.
Okay. And then
unlike the credential. So
another question for youth: when we get transcripts or report cards, is this the only way the youth will have an MSG? Is if they pass that quarter?
Yes. So you're talking about an in-school youth or an out-of-school youth who's participating in secondary education. So we're going to talk about a couple different types of MSGs, but as far as let's see, Darnetta, I think I might have to have you expand it. Yes. Are you asking the only way you can document is if they passed it? If they passed all of their classes for a youth in high school? I think that's what you're asking.
Okay, maybe we'll give her a second to.
Okay.
Yep, she responded.
I thought that was Michelle Greabley who said that too.
All right.
Okay, so we can move on because I want to explain a couple of things that I think we're being asked about, Darnetta.
Okay, we're going to go into the next scenario, but if you're watching the chat, Sarah and Michelle are sharing space on the chat space. So Michelle submitted a question through Sarah's chat, and one thing I wanted to point out is that what we're trying to do through all these training sessions, especially the next couple, this one with MSG and credential attainment, I think we all are hesitant sometimes to recognize what we know. And so we look to others, and we look to Paula for guidance. And the hope is that as we go through these, and the reason why we're using these scenarios is to get people thinking and recognizing and being more confident and comfortable in making a decision on your own. We know there are going to be those odd scenarios where we just can't come up with a response within our own unit or local area. And so we reach out to the state or to another local area, and that's totally understandable. But we hope that you're gaining enough knowledge and understanding how you should walk through the thinking process for each of these measures that we are going to cover in these next several sessions. So again, you can be more confident and not feel like you don't have the answers, because in many instances, it seems like we get questions from people that really has the answer built into it. They just don't recognize that. And so think of it that way. Learn and get more confident in understanding this. And if you have additional questions, always feel free to reach out to us. I know, I'm like Sarah, I'm new to this performance world too, so I've got a little bit of hesitancy sometimes, and try not to express that out to all of you and confuse you even further. But we're here to learn together, learn from each other, gain knowledge from the experiences. And so as they always say, there's no question that shouldn't be posed. If you have one, let us know. We'll answer it. As rudimentary as it might be, somebody else may not know that. They might be new to the world of performance or even WIOA. So we appreciate all these questions and your input. And we got one more here, Paul, before we jump to the scenario.
Yeah. And to your point, especially keeping an open mind when we get into these two new next types, if you're intrepidatious about adding a gain, we intend for these to be flexible. You can always fall back on proof and validation in your IEP and ISS, and a monitor is just as likely to ding you if you didn't record a gain that one of your participants achieved as they are to question something that you documented if it can be backed up. I mean, we don't think that you're just erroneously adding all these MSGs to boost your, performance. So that's one thing to think about. And then I'll read Joel's question. If someone who is currently enrolled in a post-secondary program that began in January is enrolled in WIOA during a current semester, like say March, and complete the 12 credits, do we count that MSG even though we didn't issue an ITA for that semester? So in other words, you're saying you enrolled someone who was already in post-secondary training on their own, being paid for outside of WIOA. Well, in that case, you probably, I'm sure you didn't, enroll them in a post-secondary or occupational skills training funded by an ITA. So this is a kind of an operational parameter. They would not be counted in the denominator of the measure for that program year if they don't have a training service on record. So you're off the hook. However, and this did come up the other day in the smaller group discussion, if you enroll someone in, you bring someone in and they're already in training, but you say, since OJTs count, and if it was an adult, you could document measurable skills gains that they are achieving, and not all of the, this will all be in their IEP, but they don't have to reflect on the service that's triggering them. So yes, that's just an example. I think that's what you're asking, Joel. But the point is, if you don't provide them a WIOA funded training, you're not gonna be on the hook for their MSG anyway. If we can talk about this later. If for some reason they couldn't fund, that program year ended like June 30th, and they dropped out of training, and then you kept them in the program and opened their occupational training service and funded it with an ITA, that following program year, you are going to be on the hook for them. So you should and you will be allowed to enter their post-secondary transcripts. They should be documented, but they wouldn't be allowed or recorded as an MSG in your scenario. So that was a lot on that. I'm just trying to clarify because that is confusing. Oh, so if we open a training service in March, so no, you would have to, well, if you open occupational skills training to provide support services for the balance of the semester. So you would actually have to be providing the training too. Support services alone would not include them in the measure. So therefore you'd be allowed, you wouldn't even need the MSG unless you had them enrolled in training. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it appears so. Joel responded.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not scrolling down. Okay, got it. Okay.
I think it's critical as you think through this that you're looking at both sides of this calculation. Are they in it to begin with? So are they in the denominator? And we've already talked about a few scenarios where the individual would not even be in the denominator. So obviously they wouldn't be counted in the numerator. But once we know they're in the denominator, now we've got to figure out, can we really identify that they've achieved one of the 5 types of MSG so they can get into the numerator and be counted as a positive. So Again, we got a couple more types here. We'll go into another simple scenario, and we just need to keep reminding ourselves we're looking at this from the top and the bottom of the calculation to determine if they should be counted first, and then are they counted as a positive if they are. So here's a third scenario, fairly simple. Rashad entered training in January, completed it in May, got a positive report from their employer, became employed, which is good. That's what the OJT is designed to do. They're an adult individual. So if you can put this next poll up, Kristen, let's just kind of see what people think about whether Rashad earned an MSG or not. All right, quickly coming in here. Okay, looks like all but a couple. Would be interesting if someone responding with the no might be able to quickly type in the chat their reasoning why they don't think Rashad has achieved an MSG. In all these scenarios, you know, they're very lacking in information. Obviously, none of our customers or participants would be this short of information in order to review and determine if an MSG. So sometimes the lack of information leads us to believe something that may or may not exist. You know, our response would be, looks like we've got pretty much everyone in here, over 90%. There are a handful. So if you've got a reason in the back of your mind why you're responding to no, it'd be good to hear, because it might be something we're overlooking. But simply, you know, the fact that they've completed an OJT, we would consider this individual as having succeeded and achieved an MSG in program year 2019. Remember what the period is. While this is a 2020 date, that is actually program year 2019. So, you know, not necessarily a trick question, just keeping in mind again, when they achieve that measure or that, you know, or that type of MSG. And as an adult, they certainly account as far as an OJT, with a reminder there at the bottom that if they had they been a Title I youth, then they wouldn't count in the measure at all, because OJTs are not considered education or training. So again, you know, we you know are okay to listen to those that might have a different thought on this, so that we can learn from you, because it might be a scenario we encounter in the near future or sometime further out. So feel free. You know, we're not going to criticize you for your response. That's what we're here for. We're all going to have different opinions of what we're seeing in these scenarios. So we're going to go ahead and move on with Paula in presenting. But again, if you feel like you have a legitimate reason to say no to that response, that scenario, feel free to drop that in the chat. Pass it back on to Paula. We've got a couple more types. We do have one more question in the Q&A, but we'll get that after we get through these two types. Paula?
Sure. Okay. So as I said at the beginning, there are 5 types of MSGs. Right now, we're going to talk about the type we call training milestones. So what are training milestones? They're multiple different things, and they should directly reflect what someone is doing in their training. They can be, training milestones are considered to be things like progress reports, but they have to show that someone's successfully completing. From an employer, if an adult is in an OJT, for example, or from someone's training provider. They should always be noted in someone's individual employment plan or other goals that have been mentioned. So they should always tie in with that. Whenever you're tying in these training milestones, which we are flexible with as far as documenting, as long as they're related to those goals clearly stated, you can't go wrong. I mean, if it's significant. So they're not necessarily based on a document such as transcripts or report cards or a test. They vary depending on the type of training program your participant is in. But they should always show substantive skill development. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide lays out specific examples of training milestones. I don't like to name too many specific examples because while it is true that milestones include like completion of an OJT or 1 full year of an apprenticeship or other milestones from their employer or another training provider, it's not just limited to that. So training reports on milestones can be anything that in your mind working with someone makes you know that the individual has mastered something needed for that job or steps to complete their program. Again, OJT or registered apprenticeship. Pay stubs, simply showing an increase in pay. That must result from the person learning something, progressing. They're not going to give them a raise unless they have made that progression. So that alone could document a training milestone. And it can be an employer, or I want to give another example. As we mentioned before, these types of MSGs may overlap. Consider you have a part-time college student, post-secondary education. So they start in the fall, but they're only doing 6 credit hours. That's, say they started this September. PY 21, they're only going to get 6 credit hours no matter what. So right there, they're not even in the running to get an MSG for a post-secondary transcript. Well, unless they progress on to the next semester, but say they only are in for another 4. Where your thinking should lead you is that, yeah, maybe they're not meeting the criteria for a full-blown post-secondary transcript equaling 12 hours in 1 year or 12 months. However, in each of those semesters, you may have progress reports or things from their training provider that you would document as a training milestone. That's just one example. So if you ever have read the Teagle, DOL specifically states and mentions OJTs and apprenticeships, but then they go on to say, we're not just talking about those. This should be documented based on your participants' training. Next slide, please. Okay, so we just talked about training milestones. Those are pretty flexible. They're pay stubs, they're notes from employers, training providers, things like that. The last type of MSG we're going to talk about, we call skills progression. In a system of record, it might be skills progression, credential, diploma, degree, certificate. So what you're looking for to document skills progression MSGs are successful passages of exams that are required for a particular occupation, or showing progress that your participants is attaining any type of technical or occupational skills. And it can be evidenced by like trade-related benchmarks and knowledge-based exams. So when you think about milestones, it's a little more flexible. When you think about skills progression, you're thinking about exams. So the documentation should be results of that exam, certificates of completion. So that certificate of completion is basically validating they took the test, they successfully completed it. That's documenting their skills progression. Then, like was stated in the beginning, technical or occupational skills through those exams. These can be they can even be documented by a training provider or employer if it's a significant type of exam leading to a certificate. And then, of course, the big one would be the credential. However, what's important to point out, like we said, since MSGs are a little more flexible, they're just trying to get some documentation and data on the smaller things that are happening through these trainings, not the full-blown credential. So, but credentials do count for this. Each MSG is independent of the other. So while you may be out of the running for your post-secondary, like I said, if you're only part-time and never get those 12 hours in a year, you still very well may have achieved at least one or two of these other types of MSGs, like skills progression for these exams. The other example that we always like to use is, and thank you so much, because we really appreciate these examples from our LWIAs. And this one is, while you can complete your classroom training for a CDL, but then you fail to earn the license. So maybe you're not qualified employment, you still did achieve that MSG by completing the program of study. So while it's not the license or the credential that you need for the credential attainment rate, we won't talk about, you have done something to earn a measurable skills gain, and that's really important to document while they're in the program. So next slide, please. Okay, so Mark and I, when we were working on this PowerPoint, thought of some things, because there's so much, there's so many layers to the measurable skills gain indicator. So these are pretty much need to knows, what you should walk away with when you sit down to talk to someone and look at your participants and figure out if they've had some measurable skills gain. So based on the timeframes that we'll do a scenario about, since someone you enroll in a program year, the second they're enrolled in training, they're going to count in the denominator for your measurable skills gain, which means you're on the hook. So since a program year goes July 1st to June 30th, if you have someone come in and you enroll them in, say, an occupational skills training on June 5th, they need one type of gain in that next 25 days. You're not off the hook just by saying, well, how am I going to do that? They don't even have enough time. So that's where we need to allow some flexibility, and everyone should be aware that even a note from their training provider would meet that criteria of the MSG. So we need to be knowledgeable about the different types that aren't the set in stone post-secondary transcripts equaling 12 hours. So that's where you want to look for those tests and those training milestones. Okay, MSGs, this is a big one. Like, we're used to the wage uploads for our employment rate measures. You're not going to be counted as a positive in the MSG until it is documented in the system. You can have it in a case note, you can have it in an IEP. It has to be selected and documented and recorded in the system of record. All MSGs should be reported, even though you could be looking at someone and be like, I don't need to report this one because they have these other two MSGs. It's important as backup documentation even that all MSGs should be reported for your participants in training. And then again, like I said, since you know you're going to be on the hook if you enroll someone in training June 15th, they only have 15 days. DOL explicitly states we should not delay enrollment in a program or training program just to avoid being on the hook for that short MSG, that short time frame to get one. And since they're not exit-based, your participants are included in this measure every single program year. You have them enrolled in training and they're participating. So it doesn't matter what they're doing, but if you have them even in a training program in and out, if they drop out for 3 months in one program year, you will be on the hook for their MSG. They're included in the denominator. So this is a side note, but for our dislocated workers co-enrolled with trade, it's important to note that an MSG must be documented on both of the applications. So for example, even if the occupational skills training is only over on the trade application, trade's paying for that, the dislocated worker application needs to have an MSG recorded when they happen, because it's on the hook for it, because they're co-enrolled, even if the dislocated worker is not paying for the occupational skills training. Those co-enrolled are all on the hook for the MSG because of the training. Okay, I don't see any questions. That was a lot. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to mention these exclusions for performance, and it's regarding exit. MSGs are not exit-based, so it doesn't really apply. These only apply to someone's last year they participate. So again, if they're exited for any of these reasons, it must be well documented, and they are removed for performance in their MSG measure for just that year they exited. Next slide, please. There'll be more guidance on exits as well as these other reasons that exclude them from performance, and that's forthcoming.
Yeah,
So
thank you, Paula. Before we move on to the next scenario, where we really get a little bit dig a little deeper and talk more timeline, we do have a couple questions that are kind of similar in nature, and to one of your last points about making sure we capture in the systems of record every single MSG that an individual might achieve each program year. So the first one is what about training programs that do not have credits assigned? Service providers who are not a community college don't always assign credits to their classes. So can you use the MSG of secondary or post-secondary report card as an MSG?
Okay, that is something I would have to look into. I mean, we'd want to see if there was an equivalency that we could count, but I think that in that case, we would be looking for training milestones, notes, and progress reports from their training provider or instructor.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well, Paula. Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just saying that's the same way I was thinking of that is, remember, we have 5 choices here to get a type of MSG, and while we might not be able to achieve one of those, you mentioned it multiple times, there certainly is probably another type of MSG that could be captured or achieved and should be recorded accordingly. And then kind of similar to that is another question said, would it be possible for someone in OJT to achieve an MSG prior to completion of that OJT?
Yes.
And I would think in an OJT, and in not just OJTs, but in many training programs, but I just look at what an OJT is. There's multiple MSGs you might achieve within that, because let's say your OJT is on computer numerically controlled operator. You're going to go through various stages of different programming, of different machinery, of different equipment throughout that. You might be able to document, without making things up, but you might legitimately be able to document multiple training milestones throughout that. Training
milestones or skills progressions.
Yeah. Okay.
And since if you look at the OJT concept with the MSG measure, we all know OJTs always kept your participants out of the training measures, kept them out of the credential. MSG is pulling them in because they want to see gains attributed to your OJT programs, if that makes sense. So absolutely. And see, that's it in the Teagle where they say, such as completion of 1 year of an apprenticeship or an OJT, it's not completion. And there's a footnote or DOL, like I said before, I hate to repeat myself, but they did kind of call that out and say, we didn't mean to limit that. It's more flexible than a year time frame. So thanks, Mark.
Yeah, and it reminds me that as we're thinking through these, if we have an individual participant in a training program, my question, if I can't find an MSG, my question would be, outside of those that maybe enrolled in a training program near the end of the program year and just didn't have enough time to achieve any one of those 5 types, my question would be, what value is the training program providing that individual if we can't find an MSG somewhere along the line? Now, certainly there are some that you may have a harder time identifying those milestones throughout, but most of these we should be able to find one, fairly easily with any amount of time in that training program. So again, the flexibility that Paul has talked about, just think through that. We don't want to get dinged later for capturing stuff that we shouldn't have, But as she said, it tends to be our monitors are finding that we aren't capturing what we should have. It's the other way around. So have your, those that are doing these should be keeping an open mind to really capture as many as possible. And even though only one is counted towards the MSG, we want to know about all of them and capture them all.
And it's easier to take one away than go back and add it after it's too late. After we reported that program year, so it's each program year. The clock doesn't ever really just stop. So, yeah.
So we got a few more responses. Great to hear from all of you. We'll take a couple of those and move through this just to make sure we
there
get
was one from Monica that rolled up.
Go ahead and answer whichever one of those. Why don't you answer Monica's? It was the first, and then let's move on so we get through all the slides. Then we can come back to the other one. So Monica's was, can you explain why MSG needs to be recorded on the 1D side for a trade participant who is not having training paid for by 1D?
Yes, because since they're co-enrolled, even though the trade program is paying for the training, the 1D is going to be included in the measurable skills gain.
Right. And then I think Laura, appreciate you hopping in here, answered the last question we had. So for something like a 6-week CNA training or CNC training, could a progress report from the instructor be used, let's say after the second week of training, stating they completed their first 2 weeks of their curriculum and are on track with their training? And as Laura stated, this all has to be outlined. This is part of the development and description of a training program. So noting that OJT, the skills would be listed in the training outline. So if you don't have something documenting that 2-week period would have got you some new training milestone or skill progression, then you probably shouldn't be trying to capture it as an MSG. But that's in the program design and description of the individual and in their IEP and all that. So keep that in mind as you're working with the training providers as well and employers for these work-based learnings of, let's figure out what are these types of progressions that we could and milestones that we could capture so that we capture those. Obviously, again, we don't want to be making things up and think just because I walked into a class each day of a week, I must have learned something and I can capture that as an MSG. That's going a little bit overboard probably, but there are probably some that you're not capturing that maybe you could have if they were outlined appropriately, and we can then document that they were achieved. So let's just go ahead and move on to another scenario. We've got a few more slides and we'll come back. We've got one more. We'll keep note of that. Couple that we haven't responded to if we have time, but I want to make sure we get through everything. So this one's more about timing and that, a little bit more descriptive. Marcus is enrolled in training multiple times. He's a 1D dislocated worker participant, and he's gone through a typical community college, if you will, training program where he registered in the fall of 2020. Again, in the spring of 2021, in the summer of 20, he took a few more classes. I'm sorry, summer of 2021, took a few more classes. And then in the fall of 2021, we anticipate he's going to successfully complete those classes here in a couple weeks. And the only reason we use those dates, it seems odd that we're looking forward, but hopefully he will complete. You'll see on the next slide, next couple slides, why we use those dates. So the question is, did Marcus achieve a measurable skill gain in PY20, in PY21, in both of those, or in neither of those? And so we see some people responding here. And as you're reading that, before you respond, make sure you're looking at those hours. We've talked about having full-time hours. So get your calculator out if you need to, and make sure we've got some full-time hours and when they occurred, because that's important to documenting them as far as a 12-month period. Give just a couple more seconds, and I'm going to move on to the explanation. Looks like everyone, for the most part, is suggesting Marcus would have achieved at least one MSG in both program years, 2020 and 2021. So thank you for responding. We're going to move on to the explanation, and that is the correct answer. If you go back to the scenario, he would have achieved an MSG in 2020, the program year 2020, because he completed classes 2 different times. So really, he achieved 2 MSGs during program year 2020. Completion of classes in the fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021. He would have then reached his full-time semester hours during the summer and fall of 2021. You see that between the 3 and 9, we have 12 credit hours, which is the equivalent of a full semester in 2021. So we would have achieved an MSG in that semester as well. So that's what we've got here explaining. We should have gotten 2 MSG positive outcomes, tracking 3 total MSGs for this individual based on the knowledge we have there. So congratulations to those that picked both 2020 and 2021 on the little bit of information we had there. And then here's kind of playing that out in a visual. You can see here, started the program back here in July of 2020, or enrolled in the program. Training started shortly thereafter in August. They completed some training in December. Also completed or began some more training in January of 21, completed that later in the spring, and then enrolled in more training. Now remember, it's not the enrollment date. That June 21 start date for a summer counts towards the actual program year 2021, because it's when they end the training, right, Paula? Correct me if I'm getting off base here. So
correct.
Yeah,
enrollment
really
in the training. Yeah, the enrollment date in the training triggers their inclusion, but the MSG counts when they fulfill the credits. So
yeah. So if, for instance, that summer class, let's say they graduated high school May of 2020 and they took a semester back here in June of 2020, we can't count that 3 towards 12 back all the way up here in August of 2021. So it's important to know the 12 occurred in a 12-month, those 12 semester hours occurred in a 12-month period of time, and going all the way back to June of 2020 would not have been able to capture that in addition to the August through December of 21. So just try to show you that in a little bit of a visual here. And then we got a couple more questions, but we're going to revisit Sherry here. We probably should have added some information to Sherry's scenario here. But now that we've gone through all 5 of the types of measures, with a little bit we know, we'd like for you to kind of answer this again. I don't know, Kirsten, if you have a second one of these, or put the first one up again, cleared out. Which of these measures, again, and we probably told it multiple times in describing the types, which of these measures could she potentially achieve? Meaning, which ones are she not discounted from achieving from the little bit we know?
Yeah, the first time we said, what would she not be able to record? But now.
And so, in reality, we'll move on for time's sake. We want to get to more questions and finish.
Mark, Brenda had a question that led right into your timetable.
Okay,
Brenda,
we'll go back to that. We'll go back to that one here in a minute. Let me just finish this while we've got the poll up.
Okay,
so in reality, again, Sherry, potentially, if we had more information after she enrolled in the program here, if we had more information, she could have achieved any of the types except for secondary diploma equivalent, but we just don't know the information. So you're not wrong if you selected anything but secondary diploma equivalent. And the only reason we know that is because she could not have achieved an MSG for secondary diploma because she completed the secondary education before participation. She might have achieved all these other ones here if we had some more information to say she might have, got a transcript or report, or she might have attained a training milestone or skills progression. So we probably should have built a little bit more information into that revisited scenario. So we apologize that it probably confused you more, thinking something was there that you were missing, but you didn't miss anything. It was us that missed it. So we'll go back to the time frame, and if you want to go over Brenda's question there, Paula. Trying to find. Okay, so I don't know, Paula, if you're hopping back on, I'll go ahead and read it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Brenda said a student graduated last fiscal year and rolled over into this fiscal year. So you're talking MSG program years, and last fiscal year MSG was their high school diploma, first quarter this fiscal year, so I'm thinking fall, the student completed an internship and was hired. What is the MSG? Okay, so I would need to know if they're an in-school youth, they're going to be in the measure no matter what. And we weren't clear if it was high school or if they graduated their post-secondary training. Oh, wait, no, that was their high school diploma. Okay, so they were in high school, they got their diploma, say in May. That was their MSG for the first program year. Then they roll over. I'm assuming that they were in school, so no matter what they're enrolled in, whether they went to a post-secondary after high school or not, after July, you're still on the hook for them, and they completed an internship and they were hired. So since you do need an MSG for your second, as you call it, fiscal year, it's the MSG program year, you could document that as, I would say, a training milestone. Even though an internship is a work-based learning that would never trigger inclusion for this youth. You're already on the hook for them because they came in school and provided them an internship. You could document that for their second, you say first quarter. So yeah, so I'm assuming sometime in September, they completed that internship, it could be documented. So they have the high school diploma, which is a skills progression in your first year, and the second year they would have a training milestone for their internship. And if anyone out there questions my answer, that's fine, because some of these there's some vagueness in the guidance.
Okay, thanks. And then we've got one more in the Q&A. I'll read you there, Paula.
I can't.
Is it accurate to say if a client, whether an adult or dislocated worker, has been exited prior to entering the MSG for that participant, the MSGs recorded in the system after exit date will not count towards their performance? So they've entered the MSG in the system, but they were exited and then they tried to enter the MSG after exit. Is that possible, and does it count the performance?
Yes, as long as the date of the MSG is before the end of that program year. Since you participated in the program year, so say you just don't have a year. So say you were enrolled in training and exited, and your exit date was May 15th of 2022. So May 15th, and that's when you got your, we'll say, skills progression, your diploma. But your exit date wound up being May 15th based on your last service. They brought you a copy of the diploma and you documented it, but it didn't happen until May 22nd. That could be recorded and it would count in that year. But if you exited them on May 15th and the diploma, they didn't even get their diploma until August of the next program year, 2022, it wouldn't count in your MSG numerator for PY22. So the system will allow you to document an MSG post-exit, but the MSG has to be dated in the same program year as their exit date. Does that make sense? Because they're not even going to be in it. If you exit them, think about it. If you exit them May 15th, they're not even May 15th of 2022. They're not even going to roll over into the MSG for PY22 because they already exited in May. You're only on the hook from them for that one program year, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry, but those dates are tricky.
We'll hit the last few slides and see if there's anything else before we wrap up. So here, the next couple slides will show you the 3 or 4 primary Department of Labor, Federal Department of Labor guidance that we rely on for, our guidance, developing state policy and responding to all your questions. A couple Tegels here outline 1016 change 1 and 14-18, as well as 23-19 are critical. And then we learned last week about a new training and employment notice that I'll show you here in a minute that affected when particular measures, performance indicators can be assessed. Then this is at the state level. So right now we've passed that on to all of you locally in a notice we talked about last week without getting into too much detail. So that guidance basically shifted measurable skill gains from being accessible for a positive or a negative outcome for states from PY 2020 to now it's PY 2022. So it's critical to know that, but the other half of that is you still have to keep entering them, because the reason this was delayed, it was originally grouped up here with employment second quarter after exit and median earnings, but they didn't feel like they had an adequate or good enough enough information and data to apply an assessment decision and potential sanctions on states in PY 2020. So they pushed it off for a couple more years, which is good. But please keep tracking all of these, because that's how they're trying to determine future assessment. And we're doing the same here at the local level, so, or at the state level for all of you locally. So just wanted to point that out, that keep tracking them, keep putting them in the system if they're legitimate, and track them all, not just one program year. Here's some other resources, both from the federal government and then from the state. And again, our policies are held within the e-policy portal of Illinois WorkNet. A lot of helpful items on Workforce GPS and the DOL website. So, go out there and surf around a little and get a better understanding. You'll see where the MSG measure is in our local policy down at the bottom. If you're familiar with e-policy, this link will take you to the chapter 3, or it might just take you to e-policy general, because with e-policy, it's kind of an ongoing potential change as far as the linkage. So we like to just send you to the main page, which won't change. But as we change, make additions, subtractions to actual policies within e-policy, the link changes. It's not a set link. So we don't like to share a link today because it might not be accurate tomorrow. So always start out at the main e-policy page, but for performance and accountability, it is this entire chapter 3. We've put a lot of new policy out there recently. We're still working with Laura Dom in policy unit to get some more policy out. Majority of it is just clarifying federal guidance, but we are going to be adding some attachments and appendices to further provide guidance and information for all of you. So keep that handy as a bookmark in your system. So here's our upcoming schedule. As I mentioned, MSG credential attainment, probably the two most difficult measures to track. So we're going to be talking about credential attainment in a couple of weeks, have that marked. Hopefully we get the official notification out Monday with the next ICSPS, Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at ISU. Hopefully it comes out here in the next couple days, like I said, or Monday when they send out the next update. So you can put that officially on, but just put a hold on all these dates. We've got 3 more scheduled. And to a couple notes, the MSG and credential attainment on December 8th, what that's going to be is really, we had a lot of great questions today, and we know you have many more. So we're going to have kind of a sit down breakout virtually into a couple, 2 or 3 groups. We're going to help guide some conversation around scenarios. So we're probably going to try and reach out to all of you, or if you want to send us a scenario that you'd like to have discussed, please send that to Paula and CC me. We'll identify some scenarios in those breakouts. We'll also, if there's time available, discuss any other scenarios that you might bring to the table that day. But our priority will be those ones we receive in advance, so that we're fully confident in how we need to discuss them and not on the fly. And then we'll come back together after the breakout sessions and recap what we discussed in those with everyone. So if you happen to be sitting in on the credential attainment and feel like you might have missed out on the MSG, don't feel bad. You'll hear from that group or groups when we reconvene. So to that point, what we really need, I want to provide some thanks to several individuals, Michelle at LWIA 20, Paul and Mike at LWIA 3, and David at LWIA 15, who helped us over the last couple weeks and have agreed to kind of help us develop these PowerPoints and the information and make sure we're vetting everything we can that we're presenting you. We could use more of your help though. So if you're interested in the next few weeks helping us prepare for these next 3 sessions, email Paul and myself, let us know your interest. Especially if you are one that likes to talk a lot, like I do sometimes, and want to be helpful to presenting information, we would appreciate that. I know, all of you, we love listening to Paul, especially. She's got such great information, but you probably don't want to hear me as much as I tend to talk. So let's get some of your voices here, hear from each other, and help us out through these next sessions. And then sometime in December, hopefully we can set a plan for more sessions in the calendar year 2022. We know a few of those will have to happen on a schedule based on when we have to do local negotiations, based on when we put some new policies out around career planning, et cetera, and when we have some more updated information on the iPad system. So again, I appreciate the 4 of you helping us and continue to help us moving forward. We could use more voices and bodies. Let us know. We'll get you invitations to the meetings we hold each week to discuss these. And we'll do a much better job by having more and more of your voices. So I'm looking real quick. We've got just a couple minutes. Kirsten shared where you can get the PowerPoint already in the chat. She's also letting you know if you're not getting these weekly emails, please click on that link and get out there and get registered to receive them. So that you can get registered for all the training. It's not just our performance, but all of them the system is putting out. And a lot of them on those WIOA Wednesday webinars in the morning. We're using the afternoon slot. Paul made a comment, as long as it's positive and substantial, since 2 weeks is a third of the program, 2 weeks may be considered substantial portion of training. Yeah, again, back to how you know if you've made some progress or reached a training milestone. That's something I think you want to make sure it's getting documented though. Not just assuming the fact that somebody's been sitting in class for a period of time, that they've actually gained some knowledge, but that it's a gain towards some kind of a goal, some kind of a milestone. And let's see over here. All right, so the other questions were all about getting the materials from today and also getting signed up to register for December 1st. So Kirsten has sent that again. We'll have you the link to get signed up for December 1st at the latest on Monday when the update goes out. But if you would put a hold on your calendar, we appreciate it. Thank you for your participation. Appreciate you joining us today. We've had a great group, great conversation. Paul, I don't know if you have any final comments.
No, I don't. Just thank you very, very much.
Excellent.
For joining us.
Yeah, here's our contacts. For anything, feel free to email us and we'll help you out in any way possible. And until for a couple more weeks, we'll see you December 1st. Everyone, please have a safe and healthy holiday week coming up next week, and we'll talk to you in a couple. Good night.
Bye. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Bye.